Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the executive director here at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's special event is entitled A Forgotten Story of Holocaust Refuge in Bolivia, featuring anthropologist and historian Dr. Sandra Gruner-Domic. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we occupy throughout the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's event is part of the KHC's Holocaust Memory and Jewish Identity Across Latin America and the Caribbean series. These programs focus on the intersection and formation of Jewish and Latino identity as it responds to the political and cultural forces within Latin American countries, including the impact and legacy of the Holocaust. Today's event is underwritten by the Eva Bobro Memorial Fund and is co-sponsored by 9 organizations around the country. They include the Martin Springer Institute at Northern Arizona University, the Holocaust Education and Resource Center at Keene University, the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University, the Reef Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christopher Newport University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of Crimes Against Humanity, Genocide, and the Holocaust at Western Washington University, the Holocaust Genocide and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Institute for Genocide and Massive Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University, and the Sam and Francis Freed Holocaust and Genocide Academy at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I'd like to thank our colleagues today from the Media Services team, as well as the KHC's Museum Coordinator, Barana Soman, for all their help in producing today's event. Before we begin, for those of you attending in person, to please turn your cell phones off or to put them on vibrate. Excellent. Thank you so much. And after the presentation, we'll host a brief Q&A. For those of you watching online, please be sure to drop your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you here, we'll also pass a microphone. And so to kick things off, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Dr. Raquel Corona, who has created this important series of programs. Dr. Corona is a doctoral lecturer in QCC's English department and was one of the KHC's NEH Faculty Fellows in 2024-25. Dr. Corona began her time at the college as part of the CUNY START program in 2013 as an advisor and program coordinator. Her PhD in English from St. John's University was a rhetorical exploration of how transnationalism affects the circulation of stories about the Latinx woman's body and sex. The years she spent as a student affairs professional supporting students outside the classroom in their pursuit of a college education has truly shaped her teaching in pedagogy and commitment to student-centered and socially just teaching practices. Dr. Corona, the floor is yours.
All right, so let's get into this juicy bio for our wonderful speaker today, Dr. Sandra Gruner-Domic. She's an anthropologist and a historian with expertise in migration, Latin America and Europe, transnational, and cosmopolitical forms of sociability. She was a Fulbright Scholar to Bolivia for the 2022 to 2023 academic year, researching on Jewish migration to Bolivia from 1937 to 1952. Her research has been supported also by the Manya Friedman Fellowship at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Mandel Center in 2023 and the 2021 Bernard and Molly Stewart JDC Archives Fellowship, as well as the Association for Jewish Studies. Previously, she worked at the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation and taught at USC, as well as the California State University, Long Beach. She has recently published in peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes on her archival research of the Jewish refugee community in Bolivia. And in our event today, she's going to share from that research and discuss the geopolitical inferences and responses to migration of undesired people in unexpected regions. So please welcome me, Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gruner-Domic.
Thank you so much for inviting me today to talk about. I will first like to thank Raquel for the nice introduction and Laura for inviting me to talk at the Kupferberg Holocaust Center today. I will present on, and let me put my my PowerPoint so that you can see that. My topic today will be a forgotten story of Holocaust refuge in Bolivia. Not many people know that Bolivia was one of the last options for refugees fleeing persecution besides Shanghai. At that time, when in the end of the 1930s, the refugee crisis reached its peak. But thanks to two scholars, both were children of refugees themselves and born in Bolivia, they have published these two books. One is Leo Spitzer, who wrote Hotel Bolivia, and the other one is Leon Bieber, who published Presencia Judía en Bolivia, the Jewish presence in Bolivia. And they have put or made the first mention to Bolivia as being a place of refuge. Both authors explain this refuge place as in different forms. One, Leo Spitzer talks about transit, and Leon Bieber, tries to bring the story of those contributions of those who stay. However, it is important also to mention that in the 1940s, Bolivia became a new Jewish diasporic option in South America. I would like to start first bringing an example. This is Susie Kaminsky. She was 9 years old when her father Joseph was held in Buchenwald after Kristallnacht. Her mother, Emily, asked relatives for help as having immigration papers was the only way to get out of detention. Her aunt mentioned that cousin Paul Bender was helping them to get visas for Bolivia, as her own husband and two of their sons were also in prison. Emily asked Paul for help, knowing that he will do it, as he had also helped Paul when he needed to hide because he was persecuted as a communist and as a Jew. Paul Bender had spent several days at Emily's home in Reichenbach before crossing the green border to Czechoslovakia in 1934. Now in Bolivia, Paul was able to send visas for all these families and 33 other fellows. I would like to briefly today explain how this mass migration to Bolivia was possible, then describe a little bit of the actors and institutions who helped to consolidate that, as well as some of the lives of the refugees. And at the end, finalize with mentioning why it's so important to observe and consider refugees movement as globally in general. This, I would like also to mention that this research is part of a larger project that will be published soon. So, how Bolivia became a place of refuge. In 1935, there were no more than 300 Jews living in Bolivia, many of them who arrived pretty recently and formed the first organization. Also, the same year, Bolivia had ended its war with Paraguay. Though in a very short amount of time, in 4 years alone, between 1937 and 1940, Bolivia received a surprising number of 20,000 immigrants, and that is modestly estimated, becoming so the first large-scale migration in a country of 3 million inhabitants, at the same time also being the size of Texas and California together. That in less than 10 years, Bolivia transformed into a vibrant community with many synagogues in different languages. In La Paz were several. They had a school, a kindergarten, an elderly home in Cochabamba. To give you a better impression, between the years 1933 and 42, conservatives estimate that 90,000 German and Austrian refugees were living towards Latin America. Scholars state that only 10% of them enter before 38. Since mostly the main countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, were increasing their restrictions to entry for Jews, the scholars call a paradox that 90% of those 90,000 Germans and Austrians made it to Latin America the years after. But that's the good case, a good example to explain Bolivia. Bolivia opened its door for migration in 1936, as I mentioned, after the war with Paraguay. It never changed its policies compared to other Latin American countries, and so became the backdoor immigration to South America. The fact that Bolivia was ignored as a country willing to absorb European immigration raised my interest into that, and also why some many facts of that were overlooked. Bolivia in general, because it has been characterized as a poor, undeveloped, and especially because of its large indigenous population, was not considered a good place for immigration, nor a good fit for refugees. This assessment became an important narrative, bringing Bolivia into oblivion. But history tells us something different, and I would like to explain why. Bolivia had always wanted to promote immigration, following Argentina's model of settled colonization. But because of different reasons, it never materialized. Some of the reasons were because the Creole elites never invested in migration. Some of the migrations they started failed. Or the other major reason was because it had very different wars with neighboring countries. However, Bolivian elites were unanimously convinced that the lack of population hindered its economic development, as well as securing the distant borders of the nation. But Bolivians were not alone in this way of thinking. They follow trends in Europe that advocated and were convinced of the popularity of colonization, which they thought it serves as a tool for management of people and nature. This way of social engineering thinking was widespread in Europe as well. Expecting to bring economic development and civilization, as well as increase white population, Bolivian politicians intended for decades to attract immigrants, more so after losing the war with Paraguay. The war with Paraguay was a key moment for this decision because those military generals that fought during the war and later became, they realized that Paraguay had managed first to settle Mennonites in the disputed region, claiming territory for their own and also providing the troops. This new government, who was mostly of the veterans of the war, and called themselves also military socialists, implemented intensive migration policies, changing laws, arranging bilateral agreements for colonization. Bolivia wanted to take advantage of immigration of Europe, though feared as well competition from other countries like Ecuador, Chile, and Paraguay. They were also interested in agricultural colonization. At the same time, we had this migration crisis in Europe. At the end, the first refugee conference organized by the United States in 1938 intended to convince or commit 32 countries to compromise to have some quotas and receive refugees. Bolivia was also present at the conference, but did not mention taking any refugees, although it had just passed many laws to increase migration. This is only possible to explain because Bolivia had just filed a complaint against Paraguay at the League of the Nations for their intentions to receive 15,000 refugees in the Chaco region. We have to remember that at that time, 1938, Bolivia still had not signed an agreement with Paraguay, a peace agreement. Because of staying silent, no colonization project with international organizations, as the one with the Dominican Republic, was set in motion for Bolivia. Nevertheless, Bolivia took its own initiative. 1937 and 38, 2,000 refugees, mostly political persecuted, arrived in Bolivia. And that's the case of Salo Shining. Salo was a young man convicted in 1936 for distributing flyers against the government to 18-month prison. After his release from the Dresdner jail in October 1936, he arranged to get a foreigner's passport. He was born in Germany, but he was of Polish parents, and so not considered as a German. In March 1937, he fled Germany, crossing the border to Czechoslovakia, where he realized that there were so many people trying to get asylum that the only recommendation he got was to go to South America, as going to Palestina was impossible. Salo's decision to go to Bolivia was because he heard from letters that other immigrants had sent that it was easier to get visas for relatives there. So he wanted to get his mother and his sister as well to Bolivia. Also had a non-Jewish, Salo had also a non-Jewish girlfriend that he could not see anymore without risking her life and his life as well. So his girlfriend decided also to go with him to Bolivia. And here you see them in the picture, both on their ship and later in Cochabamba. So Bolivia had other initiatives as well. So the Bolivian Minister of Migration signed bilateral agreements with Poland and Czechoslovakia. The Foreign Affairs Minister had also organized immigration agents who were all Bolivian Jews or Jews with residency in Bolivia, who were sent to Europe to gain and select immigrants there. This was done in collaboration with the Circle Israelite. In Bolivia, there were 5 types of visas that people could use to enter. And those for permanent residency included this agricultural schemes or sized individual or global. They had also such visas called for objeto determinado, which were used to private enterprises requesting workers for a specific task or jobs. Then there were the llamadas or family reunification visas. the tourist visas and the investor or capitalist visas as well. All visas needed an authorization from the Ministry of Migration, except the tourist ones. Bolivia had started issuing global visas, which meant the approval of one visa could 1,000 to 2,000 people enter with one permit. Also reinstated after the war the tourist visas because they also wanted to promote and incentivize investments in the country. Those global and tourist visas both became widely corrupted. Bolivia was not the only country in Latin America that had those kind of visa scandals, but the corruption was also facilitated by the navigation companies and many other people who were trying to help as well people to get out. The navigations company, as you see here, the Palestinian Orient Lloyd, sold boat tickets in combination with the visas itself, so like a combo, and charge the two-way trip just in case they were not accepted to disembark. Besides that, Bolivia was one of the few countries that offered visas when, after 1938 November pogrom Kristallnacht, most people were trying to find a place where to go. Those families, like the Kaminsky, as I mentioned at the beginning, who had mostly male relatives incarcerated. Also, the Jewish Gemeinde Berlin mentioned that 600 visas were received for detained people. So around 1938, immigrants arrived in groups of 200, 400 monthly in Bolivia. And the year after, 39, the groups were even much larger, between 400 and 900 monthly. The official report of the Ministry of Agriculture and Immigration stated that 20,338 visas were issued until 1939. The same report affirms that an immigration was desired but was not well prepared, as immigrants did not spread out through the country and stayed into the larger cities. So this sudden arrival of so many people created shortages in housing, food, and other essential supplies. And immediately Jewish groups concerned started to organize themselves, creating shelters and kitchens. Later, also with the help of international organizations as the American Joint Distribution Committee. It is only then when, at the beginning of 1939, Moritz Hochschild started to first also help and mobilize efforts for Bolivia. Before, Hochschild had helped to many efforts to redirect 10,000 refugees to enter Argentina without success. Hochschild was a German Jew that came to South America in the 1920s. He had established a transnational mining enterprise in 4 countries, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. He was the second wealthiest man in Bolivia, with influential networks and excellent contact with the highest government officials. In February 1939, the JDC sent 2 men to survey Latin America for larger settlements. They visited Bolivia as well and met with President Bush, even though they were not allowed to make any agreements on behalf of the JDC, but only because this meeting was organized by Hochschild. The president of Bolivia agreed to accept 10 to 20,000 immigrants for agricultural colonization to the GDC surveillance. Until 1939, all immigrants that came to Bolivia made it through their own means and networks. The Jewish aid organizations like the HISEM and the Joint helped those who could not afford to pay their travels or borrow some money for immigration. Those like the family of the Shiniks, those families who had the special circumstances. Because remember, Salo was of Polish origin. He was convicted. He had a mother who was a widow and along with two teenagers. Salo had lost his father at a young age and became also one of the breadwinners. So they could not even afford to pay the tax fee for immigration in Germany. Though as soon as Salo arrived in Bolivia, the next day, oh, I'm sorry, where is my Salo? The next day he could request successfully a visa for his mother. So Hochschild's major involvement was lobbying, but also elaborating this settler scheme with advisors of the Jewish Colonization Association and the finance support of the JDC. Although I have to mention that this agricultural settlement came only in 1940s to fruition. So in that year, at the intensification of the war in Europe changed completely the policy of Germany towards deportation instead of emigration, and set a stop of the refugee movement at the end of 1940. But in Bolivia, Jewish life consolidated, and for the first time, Bolivia became to be known as a diaspora center in South America. So there are many different stories of those refugees who went to Bolivia. Mostly are the ones described from the perspective of the German and the Austrian refugees. But there was also a very large community of Eastern Jews. In the early years, those communities very separated from each other. That is mentioned in many memoirs and interviews of the survivors. For example, here we have Günther Friedheim, who says, I quote, "Yes, I went to the synagogue, but about the synagogue in Calle Junín, so on Junín Street, I had no idea that existed." End of the quote. Also, Gerd Philipsborn mentioned, and I quote, "The Polish hold together distant from us, and we, the German, live it only among us." End of the quote. However, although this, even if that is true that the two communities were separated, they lived though they had interactions among them both, be it in doing business or on other occasions. They definitely not intermarried so much to each other, but especially those immigrants who were of Polish origin, for example, and had lived for a very long time in Germany, as the case of the family of Salo Scheinig, they were connected and interacted in both groups. Or also the Buchmann family, who arrived, who were from Poland and Hungary. They lived and they met in Germany and married over there. This Buchmann family had 3 kids and emigrated from Breslau to Bolivia with the 6-year-old and 2 twins who were 3. In the middle, you see Arthur Buchmann, who had shared with me his life and also many of the photographs. He will be here also in the audience with us soon. His father, Shmuel Buchmann, a leather and shoemaker, started a leather good business manufacturer in Bolivia. Her mother, Berta, ran a diner. Though when she got pregnant and had her new baby, she needed help, so the twin children attended the nursing home all week. That's a photo, for example, from the JDC on the nursing home, and you see Arturo Buchmann on the first, as the first person. Arturo also participated in the Boy Scouts. There were many Boy Scouts groups, as it was a popular trend in Germany, where they organized under political, religious, or identity-related associations. Similarly, in Bolivia, there were several sports and scout groups, but they later unified into one called the Jewish Youth Bund. It had 150 members, and this group was different, for example, also from the Maccabi. Gerd Philipsborn, who was 15 when he migrated, also mentions he participated as well in this Jewish Youth Bund, and called that the leaders called themselves or aimed to have more humanistic and anti-Nazis goals. Though in later years, the Maccabi will become the main Jewish youth organization, as the exodus of many of the community reduced the members. But young people and those who were in their 20s and 30s experienced a much quick adaptation as they felt more freedom in Bolivia. They found quickly jobs. Either they started their own enterprises or advanced in their positions from blue to white-collar jobs. Many tell very enthusiastically about their life in Bolivia. As for example, Joseph Ufer, who recalls, I quote, "I didn't go to a Jewish school because my father had a store, and across the street, there was a school, the best school in La Paz. All my friends, Bolivians, became doctors, lawyers, presidents. I knew everybody. Ask me why I left Bolivia. I don't know. I love it." He means Bolivia. "I tell my wife all the time, let's go back," end of the quote. Or listen to the clip of Inge Reich.
The IKG was wonderful. They had speeches, they had theater, they had everything for culture. And we had very good volunteers in La Paz. People that never were actors or something. They managed it. They played comedies and they sing, and we had a wonderful life in La Paz, I can tell you.
Was it a large Jewish community?
Yeah, in La Paz it was a large.
Forced migration from Germany pushed elderly people, educated, intellectuals, doctors, as much as craftsmen, working men. All of them, they had to start over. Those in higher positions or higher class, or those from advanced ages had much more difficulties to adapt to the circumstances. The adaptation was much more difficult and painful as they had also lost their status and wealth. And this is the case of Arthur Goldsmith. Arthur Goldsmith was a wealthy merchant who lost his job, lost his business, actually a family business for generations, and even had to sell his precious book collection, who was about over 40,000 volumes, only to be able to migrate to Bolivia and reunite with his son and his daughter. As you see this, his collection of almanacs later was identified as a Nazi looted object because he had to sell for almost nothing. So some refugees could never recover. Others, as Arthur Prop, expressed to have had a second chance or a new purpose in life in Bolivia. He and his friends came to the conclusion after they sat on the plaza and conversed. Arthur Prop writes in his biography, I will quote, "In one word, they, the Jewish friends, have had a second life. They were in their second life more needed as in their first one. This feeling of a second life, I had that too in Sucre, and also the feeling to be more useful than in my first one." End of the quote. Arthur Prop migrated in February 1940s as a 48 years old man. So after the war ended, survivors started to look to reunify with their relatives and friends. Also, some of the refugees that went to Shanghai made it also to Bolivia. They have heard from their relatives of being a place with some opportunities. We have to remember also that at that time, some of the first refugees started to leave and they were selling their businesses. So Helga Silverbeck is one of them. She came from Shanghai in 1947 to La Paz and considers still to be there a large community. She said, I quote, "Yes, people consider it as a transit place, but many stayed, got established, had nice businesses and factories, and they're still there, some of them." End of the quote. Helga, you can see her at 15 years old working as selling in a store. She was 15 arriving in Bolivia, the same age as William Sherman, who remembers, and I will quote, "My experience in Bolivia, when I look back, was very interesting. I did a lot of things, traveling, sailing in the Titicaca Sea, riding in the Bolivian jungle. I had a lot of friends, most Jewish refugees, and quite few Bolivian friends as my Spanish got better. It was thoroughly an interesting life. I had an interesting work. I had to travel to different Latin American countries for work. I could have been happy staying there. Such a pleasant life." End of the quote. But his parents had another goal. They were waiting for their visas to the United States. I would like to conclude making the remark that the impact of refugees movement globally was and still is very relevant today, and unfortunately little research historically. Today still exists this distorted impression that the wealthy countries take the most burden of the larger numbers of refugees, whereas proportionately the so-called poor countries had in the past and still play an important role today. So one thing we can learn maybe from this presentation is how Holocaust intersect and affected faraway regions as Bolivia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And I appreciate all of the insights that you've brought to this conversation. For those of you joining us online, we're going to take a 2-minute break to set up for Q&A. Thank you to everyone that's here. We'll be joining you momentarily. All right, so we are going to start off with the Q&A, and I'm going to turn it over to Raquel to get us started.
So I had prepared a set of 3 questions to ask you, Sandra, but there's one question that I just came up with curiously in the moment as I was listening to your presentation. And one of those is, could you talk a little bit about what led some Jewish refugees to leave Bolivia and others to stay? Like, what are like the factors or the circumstances surrounding that decision that they're making that makes Bolivia sort of like a transitory space? And my apologies if you shared that, but that was like a real question of inquiry for me.
It's always a very difficult answer to find why people are moving again to other places. Because it depends of so many factors. Definitely, some of them they were having the thoughts of going back to Europe. Others were definitely not considering this as an option at all. Let me put one example, which makes more clear how decisions are taken. William Doman went with his family. His father was an architect, and at the beginning he was working for a Yugoslav architect who and was making good money, but then even could start his enterprise alone. And after the war, he was considering all the time to go back to Austria. He was from Austria, and he was a well-known architect as well over there. And he got even the offer from one friend because of the reconstruction of the war-torn cities. It will be fantastic to work over there. Even he could get an official position at the ministry. On the other side, the family, her wife had a relative in Australia. And he decided, okay, where should we go? The kids were also almost in their mid-20s. And they decided to send first the kids and decided at the end to reunify with the family in Australia. So there are different factors. He could have continued. He had a very well position also in Bolivia. But at this time also in Bolivia, Bolivia was going through a process of nation building. There were several revolutions going on, and all that upheaval pushed many of them as well to consider to leave Bolivia as well. So those are the different factors, and everyone tried to decide it. Many tried to go. They had from the beginning visas or were in the quota waiting for their numbers to go to the United States, and they decided to rather continue that.
Thank you. I appreciate you giving us like the full range of what's unfolding for them, both in Bolivia and also like in their personal lives. This is sort of a connected question is I wonder, as we consider like the present, how many of these refugees ended up staying in Bolivia and made it their home out of those who initially went there? And what is like Jewish life and culture there in Bolivia right now? And how is that shaped at all by this migration during this period of time that you've been studying?
Yeah, that's also not an easy question because we have to see that for a long period of time. As I mentioned, after the war, also a second wave of immigrants were coming. And if the community will be too small or somehow they will not have gone there. It was one thing that many of them wanted to reunify and start something over. But at the same time, we have to remember that in Europe at the time, the Jewish communities themselves were completely decimated. What existed was people living in DP camps, all mingled from all parts of the world, of the European world, I would say better. And this sense of going back to normal wasn't there at all. At the same time, also, there were still some ressentiments of people. For example, if we see it in France, when immigrants were coming, or those survivors who were displaced were going also to cities to reconsider their life again, they were not seen, they were seen as foreigners, and they were confronting discrimination again. So all of those factors contributed that some of them decided also to go to families where they still, the information they got from their families and friends were that there was a community still existing. And the interesting part is also that Bolivia itself was a community of refugees. So there were not people before, so almost had the same experience. And that made them maybe to see them more as a form of, yeah, we are going all through the same thing.
Yeah, we're gonna hand over the microphone to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. What is first of all, the population, Jewish population now?
And that's, I forgot to mention that as well. So the population now has reduced tremendously. First of all, also the community, it started to reduce in different waves. One in the 50s, another wave in the 70s, and in the 80s as well. That is, today it's so small that we can talk about 1,000 maximum in all the country.
And also, going back in their history, Bolivia's history, were there any, even if it was a few, very few Jews there? I mean, did some Jews come in?
Yes, before there were some of them, as I mentioned, around 300. There was not exactly statistics because people were not counted for their religion alone, but as an organization, they almost recognize each other. So it's only an estimate. Those Jewish immigrants were coming after First World War I.
Excuse me, I'm talking about Spanish times, and from Spain.
Also some of them, but
yeah.
It is very difficult also to assess who were Jewish because they didn't kept. People who went to Latin America was because they were also persecuted in Spanish time, and most of them who came were called the convertos, who have turned to Catholicism. And for example, the Minister of Foreign Relations, who was very eager to help in trying to catch this migration of the refugees in 1938, he might have been also from one of those families, but this family was from colonial times, from the Spanish time, and they were very settled in Catholic then at the end.
Raquel, would you like to ask another question?
We could go to someone in the Q&A because it's connected to one of my questions. It was the first one there. Do you want to read that or do you want me to?
You can read it. That's fine.
Okay. So this person asked, are you aware of any tensions between newly arrived immigrants, including Jewish immigrants in Bolivia and the indigenous population? And I wanted you to answer that question because I read an article that you wrote that talked a lot about that, but you didn't mention that today. And I think that's an important component for people to get a sense of how they're being perceived in the country and how race and then how that sort of interplays with how they're able to establish themselves while they're there.
Yes. Yes, that's also a very complex question because it includes Bolivians who also differentiate among themselves very much into being indigenous, mixed, or white, and all those forms of identification depend very much into how people see themselves, but as well how they are seen from others. And prejudice is also a very big part that plays these preconceptions of how certain groups are being seen made inform our relations, but at the same time, for example, one of my interests in doing this research was also to see then how Jewish people perceive the discrimination of indigenous peoples in Bolivia, having experienced right now their own and being having to leave the country because they are discriminated in this way. Interestingly, it is so that we are very able to disassociate the situation of one another people, because we have to consider at that time that those refugees were not all also homogeneous. They had their differences. So much differences that, for example, you see then that those among Polish and German, they kept also separate and distant. And regarding, if I will generalize something, is that, for example, those who were of lower social status and or lived in small towns and shuttles in Europe were much much eager to see then and adapt in Bolivia quickly, look behind those differences and understand the situation and accommodate as well. Then, for example, others who were living a different lifestyle, much more modern life that everyone aimed. And so then, of course, the situation or the life in Bolivia has been very rural. It was a big city. La Paz itself was founded only 50 years before. So everything was in the beginning, and for those who were accustomed of a more cosmopolitan way of life, felt completely different over there. And so also the observing, for those people who came and observed the relations among the Creoles elites and the indigenous populations, they were abhorred. They said that that's like in medieval times, they're treating people so badly. How can be? They definitely understood that, and so that they thought about Bolivia being, in this sense, also backwards.
I have a question. And it's come up actually. So there are many people who have attended that have a connection. And it was so interesting because we were talking about your family connection before, not necessarily to Bolivia. And I find that fascinating. So for people who are trying to do research about their families in Bolivia and the connection, what resources do you suggest, or how should they go about that?
Wow, that's difficult because in Bolivia itself, there are many documents that describe the situation, but personal documents are much difficult to access. Also because Bolivia itself had just 20 years ago started more to digitalize everything, and to also to unify and make that errors. Because people used to use one name but then change to another name. It is when you are trying to look of some of those documents, you need to be in person so that nobody is altering the situation. But there are many documents of that. I found, for example, those who became Bolivian nationals, and did the entire process. Some of their records are still in the archive, not well organized, I have to say, because the resources of the archives in Bolivia are also very not well represented, so they are not thinking on preserving them so much. So therefore are not catalogized, and it's a little bit difficult to find, but some of the documents are there, and it's better to connect maybe with some historians who can help you, or otherwise ask regularly officials for the documentation of their families as well. But it's difficult. I was trying to get also some of the birth certificate from my father, and it was it was in a small town, so it was difficult to find.
Raquel?
I was looking at some of the questions in the Q&A.
So while we're thinking about, there's many questions in the Q&A, something else that kind of comes up for me is we don't talk about Bolivia a lot. And I was wondering if you could talk about why that is, sort of in the discourse around Holocaust memory, in the discourse around Jewish identity, and also what drew you to do this research?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that was my thought as well. So why everyone forgot about Bolivia? And still recently there's a major book about refugees from Susanna Heimer about refugees fleeing Europe, and even they mention the Dominican Republic, where nobody went, and Bolivia is forgotten, still forgotten. I can't believe it. It is because the impression, I think, of being a poor country, and I think that's what informed us mostly in all. Believe it or not, we don't want to be prejudiced, but it's what informed us of those who are considered poor countries and were completely at the beginning, no, nobody's going to go over there. Not even Moritz Hochschild, who was living there or had a big enterprise over there, thought that that will be a good place for refuge. And so it portrayed this this sense of, yeah, nobody's going to go over there, and therefore they minimalize the story. And also because of certain circumstances, have Bolivia said at this international conference something, maybe it would have more resonance, but at the same time it would have hindered people to emigrate there, because it was a situation when we underestimate very much that refugees, when they are leaving certain places, and nobody wants to have them because of such of stigmas, that why they're fleeing, maybe they have something to hide, or maybe they're really bad, and that's why nobody wants to receive them. Both things push very much into thinking, yeah, nobody wants to open the doors for them. So Bolivia also thought, we want to have European migration, and we will allow. And since they didn't go into the process of having big organizations to help, people had to find their own way through those illegal networks to make it to themselves.
I want to ask, are you Bolivian?
Hold on one second. We're going to give you the mic.
Are you Bolivian?
Yes, I am born in Bolivia.
Bolivia. You know, again, I'm a history teacher. All these people, when you think about it, probably if they didn't emigrate to Bolivia or other places, even I found out El Salvador, everyone has a story. They probably would have been killed.
Definitely.
And, you know, we think of the Holocaust, which was the worst experience, but, you know, people who had, even after the deportation camps, that's not an easy thing to move yourself, and a lot of people actually did in Australia. You got to give these people a tremendous amount of credit. I mean, we're seeing the world is so crazy today, but I think these people, you know, should be applauded. And I want to ask you too. You know, when I think of Bolivia, I think of, you know, a lot of the Indians, the clothing they wear, the animals that are there. What is it like, not that just talking Jews, is it still with everything and sometimes the indigenous people, you know, are they slowly integrating? Is it, you know, are they making progress? Because I know too, the politics too, something with the president that's been like, it's just like the same thing. But generally, are they coming into the modern world? And if they are, it must be an incredible, when you see something like that.
Should I answer?
Yeah, if you could.
She could use the mic. It's so hard to hear.
I know.
I will try my best. Now it's better?
Yeah.
I think I will use this microphone, but trying to address more to my best. Yes, if I may answer very quickly first, yes, Bolivia is, indigenous people in Bolivia have tried to preserve their culture. And if we imagine that, that's what the same thing that Jewish people wanted to also to preserve their own culture and their own religion. And for them, for that reason, they were persecuted because they were also considered to be backward, to be too monolithic. I think we have to change the appreciation of what means modernity and civilization, because modernity and civilization was brought Holocaust to the first place. And definitely I agree very much, the refugees need a lot of credit because when they leave without anything, with nothing, and they have to start completely over. And they adapt, they manage to adapt.
So you say the people are advancing. I mean, and I got to tell you too, that sometimes I think it was on Instagram. I saw in Peru. Then I'll really go. It's such a
Right, we actually can't.
Yes, but I
please. Can I just add that for a minute? I don't mean to hog this, but you know, I have so much information. I got to tell you, they had something on I think it was on some website, and the way the people were making, the whole town turns out to make a bridge, and it's so incredible. I mean, we think, you know, the modern things, so. But it's, you know, I even took a course once. I think Haya de la Torre, I think Peru, and he was even at that time, you know, talking about bringing the Indian in. But again, is it incredible? Do you see that, or have you seen that, where they're starting to become operators, the computer? I mean,
oh, definitely yes.
So we're gonna. Thank you.
Definitely yes.
Hi. So my dad is a survivor of that. He was actually taken to Bolivia. They were destined to go to Austria, and Austria closed its doors. So they ended up in Paraguay, and then they ended up in Bolivia. And just listening to him, how the children ended up in Kinderheim, and he's got photos of that. And then the adults went about not just trying to learn the language, but also, to apply their trade if they had a trade, or to, adapt to everything. And as the gentleman was asking, it was, from the stories that he tells us, it was a learning experience for both the Jews and the Bolivians. They learned from one another. They grew together. They did things together. They went forward together. So it was a beautiful thing for me to hear about that, growing up, to hear about how this country that people consider such a poor country, whatever, when rich countries close the doors, they opened it. And it was amazing from everything that, that he shared. So I really wanted to point that out. I'm not sure if, yeah. So
Yes, exactly. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, both. That is the I think what one missed very much into the conversation, that migration is enrichment and not loss.
So we're gonna go back to Raquel. We're running a little bit over. It's 1:15. So Raquel, I'd like to turn it over to you.
I really appreciated the conversation that's happening in person because it's directly connected to this question that I had about, because when I read your article, there was like one story you told of an individual that was able to connect and bring over like over 20 family members to Bolivia, right? And there's just this way that they're being so resourceful and being able to advocate, coordinate, and secure all this like paperwork and the ability for their families to shift and move with them there. And so I wonder, how do you think that that contributed to the communities they created and built for themselves, and the ways that they were able to connect with others in Bolivia?
Yeah, definitely. I think that made that Bolivia became also very quickly interconnected community, because the people, especially young people, went first, and they brought their parents, and that was one of the few countries who let elderly people come there, for example, because most of them, they said no, they are not in working age anymore, and no. So they not only could bring relatives, they brought also friends, and friends of friends. They brought entire communities. It's amazing to see then, when I was following some of the pictures of people of Breslau. There are so many from Breslau. I thought that they must be a network connection among them. There were many young people who were in anti-Nazi organizations that spread the word, but through them as well, also in other places, that they heard, yeah, there are visas for Bolivia. And so many people migrate, especially there, with that purpose. That was also the case for those who went early on. There were mostly social democrats, or people who first left, those who first early because of their political implications. And found a place. And there were also other social democrats that they were not Jewish that end up also in Bolivia.
Thank you so much.
Raquel, would you like to bring us to a close?
Sure. Thank you to Dr. Sandra Gruner-Domic for her time today, for what I really appreciate about our series and looking at Jewish people through Latin America is that almost every speaker has taken time to highlight the stories of people who they've done this sort of research with, and the stories, and we get to hear that in connection with what's happening sort of geopolitically. And so we appreciate you all for joining this series and for sharing your experiences in the chat. And we hope that this allows you space to be able to see and hear your own story. And so thank you all for joining us.
Thank you on behalf of the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. Thank you, Sandra.
And thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for all of you joining online and in person, and we will see you at the next event, which is happening tomorrow. Please check out the KHC's website for information about all of our events this semester. Stay safe, be well.